Hi there, everybody. Tal here. So today I wanted to do something a little bit different. Usually I speak about spiritual evolution and personal transformation. And you might have noticed that I have on my channel a video about why people hate Jews in Israel, which is a little bit different. So the reason I have this video is because, our external reality, the way the world is built and what happens in our world, of course, is very much connected to the spiritual reality, the spiritual laws and rules, and it's not disconnected. As you might know, I'm Israeli and Jewish, and this topic of the way the world relates to Israel and Jews has been on my mind for many, many years. And I have come to understand that there is something very deep and very crucial about it that can, if we unlock it, it can unlock a lot of the other secrets and perhaps reasons for things in our world, in our lives. We'll understand our lives so much better if we understand this issue. So if you haven't seen it, you can go and watch that video on why people hate Jews in Israel. But today I wanted to revisit this topic because I don't know if you've heard, but recently there was a kind of UN decision or declaration where, I don't know, most 150, 160 countries basically decided to cancel the state of Israel. They decided to allow the right of return to almost 6 million Palestinian refugees. And of course, it's not just the refugees. If you know, this is such a big thing because there's all the history to explain. I'll try to make it really short. So when Israel was established in 1948, there was a UN decision to establish the state of Israel. And when they did that, a war broke out, right? Like 7 huge armies of the neighboring Arab countries attacked this fledgling little state called Israel, which, by the way, was in a much smaller territory than it is now. It was the whole land was divided between the Jews and the Arabs, and both got about half. Maybe the Jews got even less, I'm not sure. And then once that was established, all these invading armies from the different Arab countries around Israel tried to attack the state, murder the Jews. Of course, that is what would have happened if they had succeeded, and cancel that idea, cancel the idea of a Jewish state here in Israel. But Israel fought back, even though it was a very, very young country just established, full of refugees themselves from Europe and all the other countries from the Holocaust. These people were very battered and didn't have much ammo, and it's really considered a miracle, the survival of the Jewish state in that war and many wars after that as well. What also happened was many of the Palestinians that were here were displaced. Some of them fled because they were told to flee by the other Arab armies. Some of them fled because Israel took over this territory as part of that war. And there became a situation that about 700,000 Palestinians they had transitioned, right? They moved from their old homes and were now in areas outside of this land that Israel now occupied, which was larger than the initial agreed upon land. So whether you agree with that or not, if you think Jews were right to come back or not, I'm just giving you the story. This is how these people were displaced originally. There was a decision made by the UN. There was a war that Israel did not start. Israel fought for its life. It ended up taking over more land, and then some of the people decided to flee because of the recommendations they had voluntarily, and some of them fled as Israel was protecting its territory. So I can see how this was an unpleasant situation for anybody who had fled and was now, like, they had lost the war. Of course, if they had won the war, they would have come back to their homes and everything would have been fine. Okay, if you murdered Jews, but that's not a big deal, right? As long as you have your land back. But this issue of Jews, their right to live, to exist, the right of Israel to exist, has really been on the table ever since, because it's never really been acknowledged by so many of these neighbors of ours that Jews deserve to have this piece of land. And even though there was support for Israel, especially until 1967, there was some sort of international support. But that waned quite quickly once Israel won the Six-Day War and became more powerful, I would say. And some would say it's because they became more powerful, but I would say it's more because the reason that Israel was established to begin with was not in alignment with the higher purpose of the Jewish people. And too much time had passed without the Jewish people coming into this alignment, and they were just heading into a direction until this day that was more materialistic, trying to establish a country just like any other Western democracy with a thriving economy and just kind of having these regular goals for our country. Of course, as we see with all other countries, we have the same problems as other democracies, such as division, right? Political division. We're very divided. We have political, well, corruption. There it is, corruption. We have all these problems, as do other countries as well. Except this place, Israel, is a very special place. It has a huge spiritual history, religious history, and the Jewish people were never meant to come here to create a country just like any other. They were supposed to come here to create something different. And the people who established this country, the Jews that dreamt about this country for so many thousands of years, they knew that. They talked about it. They knew that Israel was meant to be what they called a model society for the world, like a perfect, ideal society. And yet none of this was really emphasized at the beginning. The Zionistic movement was based very much on the more communist, socialist kind of ideals. And then the kibbutzes were created, right? These settlements where the principles of shared life were being implemented. But none of them had a really higher spiritual purpose to them and a connection to nature, to spirit, to God, to the higher laws of reality, which really are at the core of the Jewish people. The Jewish people, like I say in the other video, are not a regular nation. They're actually a spiritual group that once gathered around Abraham in ancient Babylon. This group came from all the different tribes of ancient Babylon and gathered around Abraham, right? Representatives of all the other nations, really. And they gathered around Abraham because there was something about their internal buildup, makeup that drew them to the study of higher spiritual connection and higher awareness of the system of reality of which we're all part. And the highest law that they learned and later became the highest law of our heritage, I would say, is love thy friend or neighbor as thyself. Love thy friend as thyself. This is it's a law, and it's more of a like a scientific formula for spiritual enlightenment, right? If you can love another as yourself, meaning you can see that the other is yourself, that it's all one thing, that it's all interconnected, that it's a system of interconnectedness, interdependency, where each of us has to learn how to connect and love and contribute to the whole, and kind of move away from that lower level egoistic consciousness that makes us separate, that makes us self-centered and thereby disconnected from the whole, kind of like a cell that is disconnected from the body. So the whole purpose was to evolve to higher levels of consciousness that are integral, unity consciousness, awareness of our connection. And that is what the Jewish people are really about to begin with. And so they attained these higher levels of consciousness to begin with, but then they were exiled from this place called Israel, which, by the way, means Israel, Yeshar El, straight to God, straight to oneness. That is the core essence of Israel. So they were exiled and dispersed all over the world because this group of representatives, these parts of the system, really, where each of us is like a part in the system, a cell in the body, these parts that had this internal inclination towards oneness, higher consciousness, they were dispersed all over the world so that one day they'd come back and recreate that connection, the state of Israel, but this time bringing the whole world up with them. Now, since they have been dispersed, you'll find Israel everywhere. There are also, I think, 10 lost tribes. So we don't even know who Israel is anymore. There's just these people here in Israel that are called Israel, but they may be very, very many of these people all over the world. And if you have a desire for higher consciousness, for spirituality, then you are part of this group as well. And obviously, eventually, all of us will be part of this group because we're all moving in this direction of higher consciousness and evolution. It's just that as a system, there are roles to play in the system and different organs, like in a body, that have different roles to play. So just like in the body, the head will lead the way, right? The heart will support the process, like every organ supports the process. But there are parts in the body that are supposed to lead the way, are supposed to guide and open up the channel for the rest of the parts to come along in that direction. And that is the role of Israel. And now, as long as Jews do not perform this role as a channel of the light, right, light unto the nations, of this higher consciousness to the rest of humanity, the rest of humanity has been pressuring Jews, pressuring Israel, pointing the finger at Jews in Israel for being to blame for all of their problems and all of their suffering. Now, as irrational as that may seem, because Jews and Israelis, I can attest to that, they just feel like they're normal people. Like, why would the world be pointing at us? Like, we're to blame for the whole world's problems? Why? We're such a small country. We're such a small percentage of humanity. What are we, less than 1%? Why is everybody pointing at us as if we are to blame? But that is because subconsciously, because of the way the system is built, the people feel that there's something about this group that is meant to perform a role and is therefore holding this group up to a higher standard than anybody else, because they're subconsciously expecting something higher to come through this place called Israel, this people called Jews. And though Jews may be the complete opposite from this higher consciousness at the moment, it's like the lower you fall, the higher you have to rise, or the higher you have to rise, the lower you fall. And so you may think that Jews can be like terrible. Maybe you've seen Jews that have gone to jail for acts of manipulation and theft and whatnot. Yeah, possibly. And I'm not justifying anything that's going on within Israel or in the world at large. There's a lot of ego. There's a lot of darkness. It's showing up everywhere. And Jews might have a big part to play in it. But the real blame or responsibility Jews have is really internal. It's not so much external. It's really the internal way that they are positioned when they are separate, they are in their lower level consciousness, they are divided, they are not implementing the teachings and the potential they have to connect amongst themselves to create the spiritual unity through which light can flow to the rest of the body. This is their true responsibility and therefore their true blame or fault. It's none of the external things, like Israel's like defending itself, for example, having an army, defending it. Like that is just simple survival. And again, not everything is perfect, but a lot of the accusations against Israel and Jews are, they come from this deep-seated emotion and they're not rational. Because, for example, Iran or Turkey or Venezuela or Syria are not singled out the way Israel is in the United Nations. Even if they've done much worse crimes against humanity, they are not as blamed and criticized and singled out as Israel is constantly. So nobody else, no other country in the world, and by the way, Israel is probably the only Western democracy still under existential threat, and yet no other country is singled out and blamed and criticized as much as Israel is. But we see why that is. By the way, as a social psychologist, I have been exposed to research that shows very interesting things about deep-seated emotion that people have against Jews in Israel that is not conscious, but really instinctive. They did a research in 2009 where they had, I think it had 3 stages, but what they actually did was they presented people with what's called mortality salience. meaning they reminded them of the truth or the fact of our mortality, of death, which is something that most people usually do not think about or repress even. We don't like thinking about it because it causes anxiety, it causes suffering. Death is probably like the worst outcome we can imagine in this life. And yet when they showed people some sort of reminder of their mortality or death, what happened next was very interesting. They saw that these people that were reminded of their mortality had a greater inclination to blame Israel and to focus on Israel and to want to punish Israel for its crimes against humanity or whatnot, as opposed to other countries that they were exposed to. Suddenly, Israel loomed large, okay? And it's interesting because when they did this research, they did it in a way that people didn't know exactly what they were being tested for. And so they couldn't like mask socially their thoughts and feelings that are really anti-Semitic. They just instinctively reacted in this way. I'll put the link to the research down below so you can check it out. So this is really interesting because it comes to show that there's an instinctive emotion that comes out for people when they feel some sort of angst or existential angst or suffering that points them towards Israel as the source of that angst. Now, if Israel is the source of that angst, it must also be the source of the solution to that angst, because if Israel isn't providing something, then that's why people are suffering. And so you see that there is something deep in our psychology, in the way we're built, in nature, that points people again and again and again towards this group called Jews and towards this country called Israel. And it's way beyond the rationalizations or the excuses, I would say, or reasons that we give for it with our minds. We really have to delve into ancient wisdom, into spiritual wisdom, into higher awareness, understanding of this interconnected system to understand it. So the UN making its decision now to cancel Israel, pretty much, I started out with that, what it basically decided to allow the refugees, those 700,000 refugees that escaped Israel, had since had children and grandchildren. So there are now almost 6 million refugees. I think they're the only refugees in the world that have this title of refugees for their children and grandchildren. So even people alive today whose like ancestors were displaced 7 generations ago are considered refugees. And it just comes to show there's something different about this situation, because this problem, this pain, this, that nobody was ever really wanting to solve it. It's just been continued and funded, and there've been kind of political pawns in this war against Israel, these people. And I personally have spoken to a member of Fatah, the cabinet of Fatah, which was the government of Gaza back when I spoke to him. Now it's just the territories. And this is considered to be the more kind of benign, moderate leadership, as opposed to Hamas, that is the more fundamentalist, extremist leadership. And I spoke to a member of cabinet of the Fatah, and I asked him, it was actually an idea from one of the Germans that were participating in this convention that I was at. And he said, what if we gave them enough money to the Palestinian leadership to build beautiful homes for every refugee that they have in their refugee camps? Would they do it? Would that solve the problem? And so I go the next morning after I had this talk with the German, I go to this Palestinian Fatah member of cabinet and I present him with this idea. I said, would you do it? If you take all this money, if you get all this money, would you build nice homes for your people? And he looks at me and he says, no, we won't. And then he dangles this invisible key in front of me and he said, those refugees, they still have the keys to their homes in Jaffa, in Safed, in Acre, of these cities in Israel. And basically said, we're going to keep them in the refugee camps in suffering and poverty and angst, because they want to go back, and we want to, we want to keep kind of flaming that angst so that they'll not give up this war, no matter how much suffering it takes. So all this money, all this whole decision that the UN just had was all around funding UNRWA, this organization that was established to support these refugees. So all this funding that's given to them, is it really even going to these people? How much of it is going to the people and how much is going to funding a war against Israel to, again, cancel Israel, get rid of the Jews, let all those refugees that are now 6 million as opposed to 700,000 back to these lands? Now, I understand why they'd want to go back. I mean, I understand that. But the real reason this is happening, because many people have been displaced in our history, right? Recent history, we have lots of immigrants and refugees, and Jews themselves are refugees from a million different countries, except they did something with the piece of land they were given, which is not big at all, smaller than New Jersey, but they did something with it. They built a country with roads and an economy, and they were productive about it, and they became independent. Whereas the Palestinian refugees, they just continued to flame their desire to go back to their lands and never did anything productive about what they do have, which, again, I understand that. I understand because there's a spiritual reason behind it. This thing could have been solved years ago, right? If Jordan stepped in, lots of the refugees are in Jordan, by the way. If Jordan stepped in, if Egypt stepped in, there could have been so many solutions. But because there is a spiritual purpose to Israel, which is it's not fulfilling, then there's all this pressure on Israel that is relentless, and it will not end. And it won't matter how much we try to create peace treaties, and we can't solve it by force, obviously. It's either going to be two things. Either Israel will be canceled and Jews will be deported from Israel and these lands will be given back to the Arabs. And even then, I can probably assume that the problem won't be over, because we still have to reach higher consciousness. We still have to evolve. It just will be in a longer process of much more suffering, and for Jews, and I suppose for everyone, if such things happen. And the second option is if we do wake up and if we do understand what's going on, if we do go into the deeper root reasons for all of this, then we really can turn this situation around from a situation of suffering, of helplessness, hopelessness, where we keep hitting this wall, where the pressure just keeps growing and growing, and hatred and anti-Semitism just keeps growing and growing, and Jews don't understand why, and Israel doesn't understand why. If we wake up, and I'm talking about Jews right now, if Jews wake up, if Jews understand what's being asked of them, if we stop fighting reality and instead listen to the message that reality has been shouting at us for so long, and we're willing to learn who we really are, what is the world demanding of us? What is it that we can do to be that model, to be that example, to love each other as ourselves, to start creating more connected society, to give a model to the world of what a connected society looks like above our opinions, our divisions, our politics, right, above our differences. This is the technology that the whole world needs today. What society isn't divided, isn't eating each other up, right, left, right, pro, whatever, medicine, anti that medicine. We have so many conflicts today, and we need a technology of connection to help people rise above their egos, rise above their self-centered perspectives and behaviors, and start to love others. And I know you may be thinking, but look at governments, right? Why aren't governments giving us that example? They're giving us the opposite example. And I agree with you. But they're like the worst egoists. They're the biggest egoists. They have the greatest desire for personal gain, personal interests, and unfortunately, but they are the result of our societies. This is what we have given birth to. They all came from our schools, educational systems, and this is what we've created in our culture of competition and egoism. So I would say it doesn't matter who is to blame. What matters is how do we change this? How do we all understand that we're all being called to raise our consciousness, to raise our awareness? It doesn't matter if you're Jewish or you're Israeli. It does matter to Jews and Israelis because they are especially singled out for this. But anybody who feels inclined to take part in this process can influence how it works, because it's an interconnected system. If you, as a part of this system, feels called to up level the vibration, the thoughts, the the awareness of our planet, of humanity, that means you have a role. That means you are being called to do this by the system. It's no coincidence. So it doesn't matter if you have a title or not, you are meant to lead into this new world, this new reality. But it is interesting to understand why these behaviors and politics and seemingly corporeal events are taking place. They do have deeper reasons. And to summarize, we all have a power to create change by shifting our own mindsets, our own attitudes, our own frequency, you could say, by wanting to connect, by learning how to do it. There is a method, there is a lot of content. I try to share some of it on my channel. I'd love to make more for you. And for us to keep asking questions. I got a lot of questions on my video on why people hate Jews and a lot of comments. I'll try to answer them. I'm here to do that to the best of my ability. And I would really love to hear what you thought about this video. It was a long kind of expression of a lot of things that I've seen and felt, and I haven't even scraped the iceberg of all the stuff that I could tell you about what I've seen in my process. But it's definitely been a process, and I hope I was able to convey to you some of the insights and understandings that I have arrived at that I feel are beneficial to any person in the planet today. Let's choose love and not hate. Let's choose to see things in a integral systems view perspective and not us against them. Let's remember we're all in this together. We have a higher shared goal, and that is the best way to get what we want, to get safety, to get health, to get prosperity, abundance for everyone, for Jews, Israelis, Palestinians, everybody in the area. I honestly, I don't blame anybody. I just want us all to live together peacefully, happily, and to really feel that love that wants to be our reality, our truth. All right, so I'll see you again soon. Bye for now. Leave your comments, subscribe to the channel, and bye for now.